Dead Space and Dead Space 2 are great examples of the survival horror genre of video games, with its gameplay and story that is borrowed from some of the best of science fiction, the Alien franchise being the prime example. Dead Space 1 was a great game. Dead Space 2 may have been the highest point of the series, it was in my eyes. However, the game sold 4 million copies against a $120 million budget, and by EA standards, that wasn't enough to warrant a success. This also meant that EA decided to try and attract new players to the series with new additions to the game. I said before that I reckon that Dead Space 2 was the peak of the series, and the only way to go from the highest point is down. And oh boy, did they go down. The third installment was titled Dead Space 3, and was revealed at E3 2012. As the marketing began to release to hype the game up, a few things were quite noticeably different from the first two games. The game was going to feature a co-op mode of the main story, a much heavier focus on action and building your own weapons. On paper, some of these sound like reasonable changes that could be made into the Dead Space formula. But in practice, it was a bit of a mixed execution. Now, I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy Dead Space 3, but I wouldn't say that I love it. There are legitimately very good things about this title, but like Alien 3, Dead Space 3 had a lot of studio interference during its development cycle. The Dead Space 3 that Visceral Games wanted to make was more psychological based horror rather than the heavy action focus it got in the final product. I've played through this game quite a few times now, and I have enjoyed it for the most part. But I still think, like most people, that this game was a bit of a letdown. This is meh. The plot of this game is so messy, and characters are very inconsistent with their previous establishments, and act really stupid a lot of the time. This really shits me, as I was a huge fan of Dead Space 2's story, and to see it be so mediocre is so disappointing. Before you play as Isaac, you're taken back 200 years into the past with some sovereign colony's armed forces, aka Scaff Marines, who are on a mission to retrieve an item called the Codex for a man named Dr. Earl Serrano. It hardly matters what their names are, as they fucking die within the first 5 minutes anyway. After the prologue, it takes the player to the present with Isaac. So we find out that Isaac and Ellie got into a relationship between this game and the last game, and have now broken up. Right. Isaac throws a tantrum and then gets his apartment broken into by two Earth government soldiers known as John Carver and Robert Norton. How Carver got in there without Isaac noticing, I'll never know. They restrain him and say that they need his help to find and rescue Ellie, as she's gone missing after she went looking for what she believes to be the home planet of the Markers. Isaac initially refuses until he finds out that Ellie is involved and agrees to help them. You also find out that Robert and Carver are the last of the original Earth government forces, and everyone else has turned into unitologists? How did this happen, and why did this happen? It's not really answered. You eventually get gunned down by a man who looks a lot like Elton John. Okay, his real name is Jacob Danik, but he's nowhere near as cool or as talented as Elton John, let's be honest. They watch over a marker on the moon as it activates, which really makes me wonder why and how there is a marker on the moon, as I thought it seemed reasonably clear that in Dead Space 2 that the sole survivor from the outbreak on Titan's station was Isaac, and he was brainwashed to make another marker, so I don't think he'd be getting brainwashed again into building one on the moon, so who the fuck put it there? So upon activating the marker on the moon, a Necromorph outbreak happens, which again isn't mentioned after the start of the game, so whoops, Earth is pretty much fucked already because of an unresolved plot detail. Good job. Isaac manages to get out of Danik's grasp and falls into a garbage heap. Seems awfully metaphorical for the series. why the fuck didn't Danik fire shots over the edge at Isaac to make sure he was dead? In co-op, it makes even less sense as Carver lands face first, and his rig clearly shows that he's still alive. Moving right along, Isaac, Carver, and Norton narrowly escape the Necromorph outbreak and go to find Ellie. Eventually, you do meet up with Ellie and... whoa! Hold on. So, Norton and Ellie are in a relationship. I know that it was said that Isaac and Ellie broke up, but there is no reason to believe that Norton has any characteristics that make him the more likely choice for Ellie. He is essentially just in the game to make a stupid love triangle. I mean, for fuck's sake, his name is Norton. The game is asking you to hate him. What makes the least amount of sense here is that Ellie and Isaac broke up as Ellie was angry about Isaac not going after the remaining markers and finishing the job. Norton doesn't want to either, as throughout the story, all he wants to do is run away. He's like Isaac if Isaac was a Class A fuckwit. What exactly did Ellie need saving from also? When you find it, she's absolutely fine. There's many other issues with this game's plot, and most of it involves this stupid love triangle. Norton further down the track ends up betraying Isaac and even Carter to Danik, as all he wanted to do was go home. Okay, so why did he go out of his way to get Isaac when he knew where Ellie was? He knew that Isaac would more than likely end up supporting Ellie due to the fact of their past relationship together, and it's so obvious that he still has feelings for her! Thankfully, you end up killing that fuckwit, and that bullshit love triangle is pretty much over, and Ellie ends up forgiving Isaac like 20 minutes later, which makes me wonder why they even bothered in the first place. The story does pick up a bit from there, as you discover you're not actually on the home planet of the markers, but the homeworld of an alien race who built a machine that froze the planet to stop convergence. Convergence being when a marker builds up enough biomass, becomes a brethren moon, and spreads across the stars to infect more planets. This is something that I actually like, as I feel like it's a legitimate direction for the story to take. It's just a lot of things in between that are just really fucking stupid as the plot goes. Carver also isn't a very interesting character at all, and the game tries so hard to make you care about him, but I couldn't give a shit, to be honest. It's hard to get invested in his character when he's only really there for the sake of co-op. The ending of the main game is actually alright, and it feels like a reasonable way to finish off the trilogy. I know about Dead Space 3 Awakened and have played it, but I'm not even really sure if that's canon, which creates a massive problem, which I'll go into soon. Overall, the story does have some really nice beats and moments to it. The premise is actually pretty decent, but the character drama with a stupid love triangle is so laughably stupid. I wouldn't call the story terrible, but it's just so mediocre and messy for a Dead Space title that it kind of makes it worse. Dead Space 3 is probably the most expansive of the series in terms of locations, which is just what the series needed, I think. Dead Space 2 played with it a bit, and a lot of locations felt quite unique, but like Dead Space 1, it took place essentially in one place with a ship, and the other being a space station in Dead Space 2. None of which were bad, of course. I'm glad they've introduced new locations, but there's a downside to maps, with some areas feeling very copy-pasted. The shipwrecks that you can scavenge for supplies all have remarkably similar rooms and layouts to all the other ships in the game, which is really quite disappointing. If someone showed me gameplay of what's on the ship, I wouldn't really be able to tell you which ship the player was on. It shouldn't matter too much if they're all fun to play and which, well, they're not really terrible, but they're not really great either. Just decent and passable in my opinion. It can feel like a bit of a chore as some rooms really do look and play the same. Later in the game the environments do get less repetitive in terms of layout and design. Particularly with the snowy areas and the inner parts of the machine on Tower Volantis. A lot of things regarding gear have also been reworked, for better or for worse. You no longer need credits to buy weapons, suits, upgrades, and no more power nodes even. Instead, you now have supplies that you scavenge for to build weapons, suit upgrades, and even other items, in particular for objective. This really changes the whole survival horror aspect and turns it into a much more action-focused game, I think. Instead of relying on specific ammo for each gun, you now have universal ammo, which can be good, but also, again, harms the survival portion of the game that the series is known for. Your decisions in the game with what you choose to carry around will be a huge contributing factor to your fate, especially on higher difficulties. You do face challenges in the game, but you can very quickly become powerful. You now craft all of your weapons at benches. They come with all the familiar upgrades like damage, fire rate, reload speed, etc. You can make really powerful weapons or extremely stupid weapons for a laugh. This is both a good and bad thing. The good part is, as the player, you feel a lot more in control with your weapons and how you want to use them in the game. The bad part is that it somehow increases and limits your options. You are now only able to carry 2 weapons instead of 4. Your weapons still have alternate fire modes, but you're still limited with the options, as previous games that had 4 weapons all pretty much had alternative fire modes too. I guess you could make up for it in co-op, but only if you have a friend. Speaking of which, the game's co-op is actually pretty fun in terms of gameplay, and you can still experience the full story with or without co-op. That's also a bad thing. In co-op, Carver and Isaac do hallucinate and may question what is real, but the story is so mediocre that it's hard to get invested with it to begin with. You also have optional missions that can be done for extra supplies, but some can only be accessed in co-op. Yay. Something that is pretty cool later on in the game is when you explore the inner parts of the machine on Tower of Atlantis. You can step on machines that overpower your kinesis and stasis. You also can carry and deploy scavenger bots to go and find you parts for you in that area. They also tried implementing more cover shooter elements into it when fights with the unitologists would occur. I don't even know why they bothered, as you don't even really fight them that much and you can't physically take cover. You can only lean over half-size cover when crouching, and that's around about chest height. You can also roll though, which kinda comes in handy for evading attacks from bigger Necromorphs. This is the part where I'll talk about the most controversial part of the game. Microtransactions. I changed my mind, this is the scariest game I've ever played. This was one of the first very big controversies from a AAA game title around microtransactions, and the first of many for EA. You could buy resource packs for upgrades, and even a bot accelerator which would make bots return much faster to benches. This is bullshit, and if spent, can make the game's difficulty so much easier for the player, as one player could be essentially fully upgraded from the start of the game. You don't have to buy them, no. But the fact that they can alter the entire gameplay to benefit you is absurd, especially in a survival fucking horror game. I personally think though that this isn't the worst part of the microtransactions. No. The worst part is potentially the official ending to the series. The last released material of Dead Space is a DLC that is stuck behind a $10 paywall, and it ends on a fucking cliffhanger. What the fuck? I bought the Awakened DLC on Xbox 360 just so I could experience it for myself. It's not really that worth it. It added some minor horror elements that the game was lacking, but it very quickly reminds you that it's Dead Space 3. EA. Why? I mean, everyone already knows why, but still. Overall, the gameplay is still quite fun, and me ranting this much about the gameplay might make you think that I hate this game. I don't. It's just frustrating, as I know that Visceral were very competent developers, and they came out with this instead. It's not bad, it's just disappointing. The game can still be incredibly fun, but not the same sort of fun that Dead Space 1 and 2 are, in my opinion. I'd still recommend trying it for the gameplay, but it's just a bit of a step down. There is absolutely no doubt that this game looks fantastic. Graphically, this game looks outstanding. I don't know if the game looks better than Dead Space 2 overall, and that could be due to the budget difference between the games. There are some parts that do look better than previous entries, such as some of the character models look slightly more polished and less freaky than before, A notable change is Ellie, who in the last game had her eye stabbed and now has a new one. The Necromorphs look great too, but they're presented differently in the game. They usually appear a lot more frequently and in larger numbers. I feel like this approach makes them less scary, and kinda makes it less tense. You can go for around 10 minutes in Dead Space 1 and 2 without seeing a single Necromorph, and that made the encounters much more memorable than just seeing 20 at once. It can be tense when you fight a horde of them, but they're more overwhelming than scary. One thing I've also noticed is that they move a lot faster in this game than what they did in previous entries, which leaves you less time to react. You'd think this would make encounters more stressful. It can, but also not really. It can in the sense that it makes you think a lot more on your feet, but you don't always have to aim for the limbs anymore to disable them. Doing it is faster, but because weapons like assault rifles are so optimized for the gameplay, it makes it feel a lot more like an action game as opposed to a survival horror game. You start off with the plasma cutter and can make it overpowered, but it's not the weapon I think the developers wanted you to primarily use. It's the most iconic weapon of the series, so it is a little disappointing. Also, you fight humans in the game that wield guns and grenades. This wouldn't be so bad if the enemies were fun to fight, but they're just so bland. The only time I found myself struggling against them was towards the end of the game, and that wasn't much to do with them, but more so to do with the necromorph aliens that you'd come across. The weapons that you create all sound very beefy and powerful, as they rightfully should, and do play their part well. The soundtrack also isn't all that memorable, but it is nice, and there's a track with Isaac and Carver towards the end of the game that is really good. The standout presentation by far is the game's locations and set pieces. I absolutely love the looks of the environment in space and how open they all are to explore. The snowy areas of Tal Volantis are so large and reasonably non-linear too. Plus, the lighting on it is just beautiful. My other two favourite locations have to be getting towards the machine and then the Brethren Moon that you end up fighting towards the end. I think the scale is awesome, but the context is absolutely ridiculous. Even more ridiculous than the hive mind from Dead Space 1. I also think it was a very poor choice to have the advanced suit from Dead Space 2 in the trailers and marketing, but then have it removed from the final game. However, thanks to the power of modding for PC, I now have it. The link for the tutorial will be in the description for anyone who wants it. Overall, the presentation is very good. Just some things I wish that were different surrounding the direction in particular. Dead Space 3 is a fun but very flawed game. I see it very much like the Alien trilogy. The first two films were great, and the third wasn't all that terrible, but the dive in quality when compared to the first two installments is very obvious. The story is so mediocre and messy, but has some great beats and additions to the lore of Dead Space. The gameplay somehow adds more and subtracts more with the options to use in combat. The microtransactions are really slimy, and especially for the last part of the story and potentially of the series. And the presentation also has some great environments, but suffers from taking away so many horror aspects trying to appeal to another audience with more action-oriented sequences. It's a shame because I do actually enjoy this game for what it has to offer. Not as much as 1 and 2, but still quite a bit. This and Awakened were the last pieces of media that came from the Dead Space franchise, and it is a bit of a shame. With Visceral Games closing down in 2017, it seems highly unlikely that the series will receive a sequel or a reboot anytime soon, as EA still holds the license. There are some rumours of a comeback though at the moment. There were plans that were scrapped for a Dead Space 4 game that would have more RPG elements and would have Ellie Langford as the protagonist. Unfortunately, these were scrapped due to Dead Space 3 underperforming by EA's standards. I wouldn't mind seeing a return to the series, but if they did, it would have to really be done right and something in line with the spirit of the first two games, of course with brand new elements. But since 2013, EA has just let the money roll in on the franchise, and it seems like that's what they're going to be doing for now.